If you were here last week, we had the first 8 verses in the book of Esther. And in that chapter, we talked about who we were going to be studying. At least we were introduced to some of the characters, as I call them. We talked about what was being discussed. Remember, we talked about the time period in history and the gathering of all the people and why they were there. We talked about, again, when in history all of these events were taking place, where the narrative was taking place. So this was the Persian Empire. We were specifically directed to being in Susa, which was the capital at the time. So all of that groundwork was laid for us in just the first 8 verses of Esther. So the who was King Ahasuerus, also can be referred to as Xerxes. The Persian name, I'm sure I butcher it, but is Khosroes. And he is reigning specifically at this time, and he is preparing to re-engage the Greeks in battle. The win was between 485 and 481 BCE, and they are in the citadel of Susa. So the Persian Empire waged basically this ongoing war with the Greeks spanning a total of more than 4 decades. So you can't just Google, Persian Greek War and isolate down to this time period, because they were, warring for a very long period of time. But after the defeat of the famous Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE, which is when Darius I went home with plans to come back, that's where we find ourselves in this conflict between the Persian Empire and the Greeks. So Ahasuerus intended to conquer the Greeks, something that his father had failed to complete. And this was the focus of the gathering in Susa that is described in Esther chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. It's really important to get context in terms of history to understand some of the details. Now we're going to move to Esther. We're going to do chapter 1, verses 9 through 12. So Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Muhammam, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and the princes, for she was beautiful. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. Then the king became very angry, and his wrath burned within him. So Queen Vashti is introduced to us here, and she is described as giving a banquet in the palace. So the banquet that the king was hosting took place out in the palace gardens, if you remember, and now we see that the women are gathered within the palace for their banquet. So the guests at this banquet were the women in King Ahasuerus' palace. So now we know the makeup of the women that are there. There is no clear answer from secular history as to the lineage of Queen Vashti. There's no corroborating evidence from archaeological evidence of this queen that had been found, at least up to today. There might be something found in archaeology tomorrow or next week, but as of right now, there is not. One of the reasons for this lack of evidence is most likely because the palace was destroyed during a fire under the reign of Artaxerxes I, which is the son of Ahasuerus. So the records that were maintained in Susa were written in scrolls or books, not clay tablets, as we have seen and will see as we go through Esther itself. So in Esther 2:23, in 6:1, and in 10:1, there'll be reference to these scrolls or these books. So we'll see that as we get further along. The fire would have destroyed any documentation of all that went on. Who married who? What did they do? What kingdom did they come from? So for us to have any kind of comparison, it would be for those of you who store your information on the cloud. If somebody destroyed your cloud and all your information was gone, that's what happened to this kingdom for that time period. There are references in what began as Jewish oral traditions to identify Queen Vashti. These Jewish oral traditions moved into a written form in what is known as the Midrash. So there is even an attempt to trace her lineage done by the Jewish storytellers. So let's talk about that briefly. So the term Midrash isn't like referring to a book or the written document. Midrash means exposition or investigation, and it refers to an example of biblical interpretation. So there's two types. One called the Midrash Halasha, and it is specific to interpretations in regards to the law and religious standards. So you have the Jewish leaders or their rabbis looking at the scriptures, particularly in the Torah, and they would be asked to give how that law should impact or be used in the current culture. So the Midrash was them debating with each other how that should be carried out, and then they passed it on originally through oral tradition. So we would have a conversation, I would tell you, you would tell her, right? But at some point they started to write that down. So Midrash is reference to the style. It's like expository, right? That's the word that's being used. So that is a style of teaching, but some people refer to the books that were written also as Midrash. There are books that were written called the Talmud, are based on this style of thinking. Does that make sense? So Midrash is a style of thinking. It's broken into the two categories. So this one here, the Midrash Halasha, refers specifically to things in regards to the law and the religious practices. Madras interpretation is largely used, or I'm sorry, the Midrash is largely used in the Talmudic literature. The second form is Midrash Halasha. So all other forms of biblical interpretation would fall into this category. So actually, I may have to go back. It's not Halasha because that's the first one. So there's a second one, and I've copied the name wrong. Just for a little history of what goes on, because a lot of what you'll find in commentaries in regards to this section of Esther rely on what was written by the Jewish rabbis. And they had an agenda. So you have to keep that in mind. So that's why we're very careful with what we bring forward from that literature from antiquity. You have to understand that they might have had a reason for why they want it to be seen in some way. So think about it. The Jews have a vested interest in how the queen is displayed in the book of Esther. They desire to make this queen their queen later, the heroine. And so this queen, Vashti, must be a despicable person. They have to show how horrible she was so that it's justified in what the king does later in marrying Esther. So you see there's that little bit of stuff going on there. They have an ulterior motive. So we're going to look a little more at that as we get towards the end of the study of Esther, right? Because we're going to then be introduced to her and see why this might be important. Remember we talked last week about one of the reasons that people didn't like to study the book of Esther was it sure seemed like there were some events that happened that border on questions of morality, right? Why would this beautiful Jewish girl marry a guy who, right? There's all of these underlying questions. All right, so back to where we are in chapter 1 in verse 9. The guests here are women, and based on our earlier references to those who were invited to the multiple banquets given by the king, these would most likely be the women associated with these men. Right? The men are gathered, they're the political leaders or the ambassadors or whatever word we want to use. So this would be their wives. And you can see that if you look back at verse 5. These are most likely who's present in the citadel of Susa and staying or being invited to this banquet at the palace. So the men are in the court of the garden of the king's palace while the women are inside the palace. So we see the separation of them. It is important to remember that Middle Eastern cultures, in those cultures, that the women are often kept separate from the men in their social gatherings. It is still very common in many Middle Eastern cultures today. So it's not hard for us to envision. We seen documentaries, we've seen things that let us know that that's a different culture. This would simply be a cultural norm practiced at this time of history as Queen Vashti is entertaining her female guest in the palace while the men are outside in the palace garden. So, a little special note here: separation of women from men has its root in this Islamic background or in this culture. It was not originally part of the Jewish tradition. This change seems to have been made in the Jewish practices in the 12th century. And I give a link to a site in the notes so that if you want to go do a little bit more of your reading on that, you can. I remember being surprised as I read this because I had the impression, oh, it's always been that way within the Jewish realm. And it hasn't. So it may have been adopted as the Jews were in dispersion in these different cultures to adopt the practice. Well, they frown on us if the men and women are together, so we'll have our synagogues and we'll go ahead and separate so that they won't question our practices. And then it became part of their culture, and then it's been introduced, and it is still practiced today. You go to Israel, you go to the Wailing Wall, one side is for the men, there's a wall there, the other side is for the women. So it's still practiced today, but just keep in mind it was not always part of the Jewish culture. It was introduced at a later time. So in verse 10, there's another clarified time given to the narrative details in the next events that happen. So we hear on the 7th day of the week or the last day. So we've narrowed down what time period we're talking about. These events are unfolding. The description used of the king as being merry with wine is seen as a man who has had too much wine. And you would be amazed at how much time different commentaries spend on this. I give you a whole list of other verses where you can go find the words that are translated as merry. All of them will give you an indication it just means too much. When they're merry, it doesn't just mean they're happy. They've had too much. That's the description here. So the king is in this merry condition and gives a command to Muhuman, Bitha, Harbana, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus. If you have a need for a list of unusual, unique names for any babies, got you a list right here. So there's a word there used that we were going to spend a little bit of time on, because again, it's not something we talk about much and it's not really seen in our culture, and that's the word eunuch. So a eunuch is a man who's been castrated and was considered of significant value to the Persians in service to the king in particular. So this is from InterVarsity Press. This is a background commentary that goes into a lot more history. And so I refer to them a lot when I looked at the different commentaries. They're very detailed on the history. So this is what we find in that commentary. Eunuchs were highly valued in government service in many varied roles. The great demand for eunuchs led to young boys being included in the tribute paid to Persia so that they could be castrated and trained for government service. They had no families to distract them from their service. That was one of the benefits. They were often entrusted with the care and supervision of the royal harem, and having been castrated, they posed no threat to the women of the harem, and they could not engender children by the harem women who might be mistaken for royal heirs. So there's the practical reason of why you would have a eunuch overseeing the harem. They would be less likely to become involved in conspiracies because they would not have their own heirs to put on the throne. You take away the incentive. Assyria, Urarti, and Media had all made use of eunuchs in government offices prior to this Persian period that we're talking about in Esther. So this is not the first time this would have been something that a large government realized was a benefit. It had been practiced by other governments, and the Persians said, hey, what a great idea. I think we'll keep that as well. 4 of the names in the list have been attested to Elamite documents. and can therefore be considered authentic names of the period. Herodotus names the chief eunuch of Xerxes Hermodamus. Herodotus describes the men surrounding Xerxes as cringing, fawning leeches who tell the king only what they think he wants to hear. So unlike modern politics. So it's not a stretch to think that this is exactly what has surrounded the king. Also, this is just extra, so I'm not charging you extra for this part. You think about it, this is a newly established king, right? His father's not been gone for very long. So there's often a strong influence during that time on who's going to be the ear to the king, who's going to be the one to have influence. So there would have been those that gave their advice to his father, who would have assumed that they would also be included. But then there would be other people who thought this was the time for them to step up and to have their points of view heard. So there's going to be controversy going on with those people who are talking with the king or have influence. So for those that would just say, oh, you did a great job, there is our human nature leaning towards, I want that guy, right, to be somebody that I can talk to because he seems to like me and agree with me. So in its expansion, you can see how it might lead to having a bunch of yes men sitting around. Again, that's not according to scripture, so take it or leave it. It's just my thought on the subject. In verse 11, the king commands the men, these men that have just been listed, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the princes, for she was beautiful. So first, they are specifically asked to bring Queen Vashti before the king. This is not an unusual request, since it is the only way to have an audience with the king. In other words, she wouldn't have just walked in and say, hey, I want to meet your banquet guests, right? That wasn't what was practiced. So if the king wants to bring somebody in, summoning them would be the way. So that part is not out of the norm that he would suggest that. We see this later when we get to the later part of Esther in chapter 4, verse 11. So 4:11 tells us, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king in the inner court who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death, unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for 30 days. So that was a common practice. I will say this, in that verse, it's very clearly denoting when the king is in his inner court, right? So that would be when there's some official business going on. So if somebody tried to approach the king while in the inner court and had not been summoned, it was a death sentence. I'm not saying that was always the case, right? The king's walking down the hallway, you walk up, you don't get a death sentence necessarily. So being very careful with where we say this is. Right now, we know it's common for him, though, to summon people, especially his wife, in the whole separation of the men and women. The king makes a special request, so this is outside the norm, it does appear, to have Queen Vashti wear her royal crown and come to be seen by those in attendance of his banquet. Of course, this has led to grand speculation in many of those who do their interpretation and write their commentaries in the book of Esther. So the speculation in regards to this verse, some has suggested the king is asking for the queen to come before this crowd wearing the crown only. We don't see that displayed here in the scriptures at all. Again, those that would potentially be putting that forward want to put their reasons into it. They want to display this as now these would be people that want to talk about the greatness of Queen Vashti, that she was so incensed about being asked to come naked that's why she said no. See, everybody's looking for the why, because we don't get the why in the scripture. So they got to find a reason. Oh, well, obviously he's asking her to come naked and just wear her crown. That is not what the scriptures say. They do specify he did ask her to wear the crown, and we can talk about that, but we can't assume that she's just being asked to come and wear her crown. So Think about this. We must remember that one of the ways Darius the First had expanded his kingdom was by royal marriages. This was the practice of the day. With this understanding, it would be true that Queen Vashti's marriage was arranged with a political advantage in mind for the kingdom. So she probably came with some royal lineage of her own. I want to be careful. That's not what the scriptures say. I'm just going with what we know to be the norm practiced in this time period. A lot of research tells us that was already done by Darius. So it would make sense that he's going to be doing the same thing when it comes to marrying off his sons to make sure there's this connection that's an advantage to the kingdom. The question would be, why would the king want all those in attendance of his banquet to see her display her royal crown and how beautiful she is? What would the motivation be for him wanting her to wear the crown? Because it was just about her being pretty. There wouldn't be the specification of the royal crown. In verse 4, we saw the king's desire was to display the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his majesty. What did we discuss last week? What was his reason for wanting to have all the splendor and the majesty paraded before all of these? It was so they would support this military operation he wants to undertake. Everything else that he's done has been for that focus. Why would we assume this event does not also have that same reason behind it? Again, if she was a queen from some kingdom that's been married in line, her royal crown would give some indication of where she comes from. So to bring her forward and to display her crown in the midst of these people that he's trying to make sure will support him, it's to give the appearance that she and whatever kingdom she's from also support this. That may be one of the reasons he wants her to wear the crown. And just to show that, look at my beautiful wife. You all know where she comes from, her daddy, her kingdom, her whatever, and she's here by my side to give support. This is one of the other reasons you should support me with what it is I intend to do. So it's not out of context in terms of the flow of the purpose of the banquet. You see why it's so important to know what time we are in history and what those first few verses told us, and looking at history, what was going on. So the king's desire may have been to display his queen in front of these all present as his final statement to display his royal glory and his majesty. That's his reason and his purpose. So depending on where Queen Vashti was from, in displaying herself wearing her royal crown, it could be seen as lending support to this upcoming war with the Greeks. Just my thoughts. Like I said, it's for free. All right, verse 12. Verse 12 reveals that the eunuchs bring the message of the king's command to Queen Vashti, and she refuses to come. It might appear to some that this would have been a compliment to Queen Vashti to be so highly regarded by the king, but her response would indicate otherwise. In other words, wouldn't you think that it would be great for your husband to say, "Oh, you're so gorgeous and beautiful. I'd love for you to come and just show everybody how beautiful you are." Doesn't seem to be anything wrong with that necessarily, but there could have been some other things that are going on. It would seem the people of the court had not seen Queen Vashti's face before. This would make the most sense as to why the request is made, with the emphasis made about her beauty. So again, in our culture, that seems to be a strange thing to think that they would not have seen her. However, let's look at what the cultural norms were. Okay, this is back to that same InterVarsity Press Old Testament commentary. One need not think that Vashti was asked to do anything immodest or immoral. See, they're reading the same thing that's out there about her. Compromising, as early rabbinic interpretations assume, so you know where it comes from if you're reading that. In some Eastern societies, the harem was carefully sequestered. The law prohibited anyone from looking on the faces of the royal women. Persian women of this time period went about in closed carriages so as not to be exposed to the gaze of the general public. If this is the case, as Josephus reported it was, Xerxes would be requesting Vashti to do something beneath her station, demeaning to her royal personage. Exposing her to the gaze of the entire citadel population would be a far greater humiliation than not bowing to an honored official, but would be a similar violation of protocol. When the king's merry state, he's asking her to do something that appears to maybe even have been against the laws on the books for the Persians at the time. I'm not saying it was a law, but there definitely was the cultural practice. So it's interesting for me. This is what sometimes makes me strange because I ponder these things in my mind and I think about them. What would these events have been look like as they're carried out at the time in the royal palace? Would the request of the queen have been put in writing? Would it be just a verbal request? Did the eunuchs each address the queen? Did they come as a group to address the queen? In other words, she's in her little private banquet with all her lady friends. How was she even approached in the middle of her own banquet? How was it interrupted? How was this? So, how did the king make his request known to the eunuchs themselves? Then, how did they go about carrying it out? I don't know, but I just find it interesting that in my mind, I'm like, that would be interesting to know. Can't wait for the movie to come out. Would the refusal be brought back to the king by all the eunuchs, or maybe just one guy that drew the short straw? Right? When she says no, that had to be pretty much a shock because the king always got his way. And I'm pretty sure they wouldn't have just said, hey, the king wants to see you. Wear your crown and come on over, right? There would have been all. And when she said, no, I'm not going, after they got recovered from their shock, are you sure you're not hearing what we're asking? This isn't, don't you think they would have tried to encourage her because they want to do what the king wants them to do? They don't want to take back a no response. So, and then would the message have been returned back to the king verbally in his merry state? Would somebody have written out, she said no and passed the note? I mean, how did that happen? Or would it have been done, I don't know, to the king privately? Hey, we got something to tell you, right? Or did they come in because he's wherever he's sitting and, having a good time, and then they come in and go, nope, she said no, right? I mean, we don't know which way it was communicated. That could make a huge difference. There is a reference by Josephus that indicates that the eunuchs came back several times without the queen. So she might not have said no just once, but probably several times. Everybody feels the tension building, right? As the king is asked and she says no. And then she's asked again and no again. Each time you can imagine there's this buildup of tension going on. All right. And each time by now you got to imagine things don't stay quiet in the banquet situation with multiple people around. So even if it wasn't originally announced publicly that she'd said no, once the eunuchs go back and forth a time or two, you got people murmuring in the crowd. What's going on? I wonder how, right? I can guarantee you that's going on. Because the servants walking around might have an idea when they see that the eunuchs go to the queen and then they're stressed and they're scurrying back to the king, right? People are going to be asking, what is going on? So people are finding out what's going on. To be seen without a face covering in public by men would have been a disgrace to Vashti, and to reject the command of the king was a disgrace to the king. So we've come to an impasse. Somebody's going to be disgraced. The king has set this up, so there's really a no-win situation. Somebody's going to be disgraced. This would have been a very disrespectful response to the king's command and humiliating for the king in front of his guests at the banquet. Remember what the banquet's all about? The emotion that it invoked as the king's response was to become very angry, and his wrath burned within him. This was not a surprise, as the king was dishonored, and it would seem the king has a right to be angry. However, the level of anger is described to be intense anger leading to wrath. Wrath is defined in the Merriam-Webster dictionary as a strong, vengeful anger or indignation. We didn't just get a little red-faced for the moment. It takes on an animal and beast of its own in his emotions. His anger is so intense, it is described as wrath. So I'm emphasizing that because it's not just the little word of anger. This is an unhealthy anger. It is not a righteous anger. And it was probably intensified by being merry with wine. This king has just communicated to all these men in positions of leadership that he wanted them to support him in this large war campaign. They should support him because he's so powerful and he would win, as he's been demonstrating all of his might and his wealth before them. This king is now seen not even able to get his wife to follow his command. See how everything is built up to this? It's a big deal. The queen, not coming as commanded, brought great humiliation to the king and experiencing this significant disrespect. His reaction, described as wrath, shows he was now vengeful in his desire to deal with this disrespect. With that, we'll now read verses 13 through 22 to find what goes next in our story with high emotion. Starting in verse 13. Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for it was the custom of the king, so to speak, before all who knew law and justice, and were close to him, Hashina, Shethra, Admatha, Parshas, Meres, Marsina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media who had access to the king's presence and sat in the first place in the kingdom. Again, for those of you looking for unique names, here's another list of unique names. According to law, what is to be done with Queen Vashti, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs. In the presence of the king and the princes, Memucan said, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also all the princes and all the peoples who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands by saying, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought into his presence, but she did not come. This day the ladies of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's conduct, will speak in the same way to all the king's princes, and there will be plenty of contempt and anger. If it pleases the king, let a royal edict be issued by him, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, so that it cannot be repealed, that Vashti may no longer come into the presence of King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is more worthy than she. When the king's edict, which he will make, is heard throughout all his kingdom, great as it is, then all women will give honor to their husbands, great and small. This word pleased the king and the princess, and the king did as Memucan proposed. So he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province according to its script, and to every people according to their language, that every man should be the master in his own house and the one who speaks in the language of his own people. So this little event that happened on this particular day has far-reaching impact throughout the kingdom. Verse 13 demonstrates the mood of the banquet has changed from a celebration to a complete distraction in dealing with this unexpected development. The king speaks to his advisors, and they're described as wise men who understand the times. The specific clarification given about their understanding delineates it clearly, for it was the custom of the king to speak before all who knew law and justice. So these were the experts of what laws governed the kingdom and how to carry out justice in regards to the law of the kingdom. They're his advisors with that very special knowledge coming forward. Probably overpaid lawyers, like I don't want to go into. I could give you some lawyer jokes, but we'll avoid that. You all have your own. The king often turned to these men to determine what was right according to the laws of the kingdom. The legal system of the Medes and Persians was extensive. So it wasn't like they had a 3 or 4 page document of laws they followed. Books and books and books, just like we've kind of gotten to, right? So we can totally understand how this is developed. So it does take somebody who has special knowledge of what's going on. Verse 14 includes these men were close to the king. So they are also specifically named in the scripture. So we got their names. These names can be verified through historical records and given historical validation to this narrative. Again, do we have to have that in order for us to believe that the scriptures are true on their own? I don't. But sometimes it's nice when you have that verification from other historical documents to say, oh, yeah, here's the same guy mentioned over here that the Bible recorded. So, again, just an extra freebie of niceness. They are described as the 7 princes of Persia and Media who had access to the king's presence and sat in the first place in the kingdom. So these were not just, average men. These were men of high regard. They came, whatever provinces or area of the kingdom they came from, these are your top 7 guys. They have the most influence. They have the king's ear, and he has a personal relationship with these men. He trusts them. That's what we're getting the detail of. They hold positions of power in the kingdom as princes and had special access to the king's presence, which was an honor, obviously. They knew what was going on in the royal court and in the kingdom. So that's what it means in the time. So not only do they have the sterile view of what the laws say, they also have an understanding of what's going on in context. So these men would understand, oh, Xerxes has not been on the throne long. He's trying to prepare to go to battle. These are the conflicts within the court. This is how important it is for the wives not to respond, right? They're getting all of the cultural impacts of the law, and that's where they're giving their counsel back to the king with both of those things in mind, the legal as well as what's going on in the moment, in the history of that time. Finally, we hear they sat in the first place in the kingdom. All that would mean is that they have the highest offices that were attainable in the kingdom without being the king. As these verses unfold, in verse 15, it would appear that King Ahasuerus has found a clearer head to make decisions from. So some of his merriness might have worn off by now. He lays out a question to these wise counselors. According to law, what is to be done with Queen Vashti, because she did not obey the command of the king that Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuch? So we're just clarifying, here's my question. What are we supposed to do according to the laws that govern the situation? That's what he's looking for. It is clear that Queen Vashti did not obey a command of the king given through his eunuchs. The king asked what the response should be done according to the law. King Ahasuerus could have decided in his anger and wrath to do whatever he desired to do in regards to the consequences here, right? He could have just said, off with their head, whatever. He's the king. He can do whatever he wants. Instead, the king does seek counsel. So I would say that's a demonstration of a more level head. He's still offended, still angry, so he's going to be willing to listen to, to maybe more negative responses, but at least he's going to listen to the counsel. We do not know if the council of men that we've just had here described for us convened privately before they made their pronounced decision to the king. So you've got to imagine these things are going on, right? You got the eunuchs back and forth with the queen, got the banquets that kind of still going on. I'm sure that whole thing has come to a complete halt. So this is probably happening either hours or days after the actual finishing of the banquet. So now you got these men that are gathered together. The kings ask them, what is the response to be according to our laws? So I doubt they're just sitting around, spouting off like a round table discussion. Well, I think, no, I'm saying these men got together, reviewed the laws, and came to one accord as to what they wanted to tell the king his option would be. Verse 16 clearly displays the counsel provided by these men was communicated in the presence of the king and the princes. So it wasn't a private communication of their suggestion to just the king. There are others that are there to hear the counsel. This group of counselors had selected, is it Mermukum, to speak the decree. The verdict relayed to the king was that Queen Vashti had wronged not only the king, but also all the princes and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. So they're putting the exclamation point to the end of what happened. She didn't just disrespect you. We feel like she's disrespected the whole kingdom by her saying no. So Memucan gives the pronouncement in the presence of the king and the princes publicly, just like the violation of the command was done. Remember, she said no, it would have been known in a public way. So they're giving their advice in a public way as well. He raises the bar of her offense to be more than just a violation of the king's command. And that may have been to link it to a more serious consequence. So there could have been a consequence if you just denied the command of the king. But if the denial of the command of the king had a ripple effect in the kingdom, there may have been other things on the law that allowed for a much more severe consequence. Don't know, but I'm just saying that's a possibility of why they want to raise it to more than just she did a violation to the king personally. They take it, said, no, it wasn't just a personal violation. She's harmed all of us. That's where they've taken it to. He says that she has wronged all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. All right, we're taking that as far as we can to the biggest impact that they can make out of it. Defying the command of the king has a far-reaching effect on all those who are under the king's command. That's the train of logic that we're following as we see these scriptures. Verse 17 elaborates on the broad impact this act of disobedience demonstrated on the far-reaching impact that it could have in the provinces. So Memucan says that Queen Vashti's violation wronged more than the king, for the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands by saying, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought to his presence, but she did not come. So Memucan declares this event will be known by all the women in the kingdom. I guess she had a strong Facebook following. All the women in the kingdom are going to know. Since we know they didn't have Facebook, how do you think all the women in the kingdom are going to know what Queen Vashti did? Well, there are many women that are attending the banquet with Queen Vashti. It is probable that the command of King Ahasuerus was known to those in attendance of the banquet, as well as the answer of the queen. It wasn't a secret. I have written in my notes, women have a tendency to share information among themselves. I would contend that it's not specified just to women. Humans have a desire to share information, but it does seem that we women have a reputation for that. So it was by word of mouth that I am sure it is going to be communicated. It's a big deal to report what's going on in the court. The servants would spread it around. It gets outside the walls. Whoever the journalist of the day are, get the report and they take it back. It's going to get out. It's not going to stay secret. And everybody knows it, which is why the response from these wise men say, we got to deal with this because it is going to be known. It's not going to stay secret what happened. So what do you think the cultural expectations were of the women to their husbands before this event occurs? Women were expected to do as asked, Not a lot of rights for women in other cultures, ever. So we have a unique time period of history that we live in as women. This is not what the norm would be. Usually it was the women were to be submitted or subjected to what the husband wanted. So this is not a unique thing to be displayed between the king and the queen. Mamukum suggests that all women will look with contempt on their husbands. In verse 18, Mamukum declares, "This day the ladies of Persia and Media will have heard of the queen's conduct, will speak in the same way to all the king's princes. There will be plenty of contempt and anger." We are not told what Queen Vashti said, only that she did not come as commanded. There could have been other words spoken. All we know, his request wasn't honored. We have no idea what she said in the banquet halls, within the earshot of others. That's not recorded for us. We only know she didn't arrive. The suggestion is that the wives of the princes will all say no to the command of their husbands. This type of reaction in the home will cause the women to have contempt towards their husbands, like Vashti demonstrated to King Ahasuerus. The fact that the word contempt here is used might be giving us an insight into the way Vashti was feeling. Because if he says, this is now going to be what happens in all of our homes, he's having to make reference to what happened in this event. She felt contempt. He got angry. This is going to spread outside of the relationship between the king and the queen to all the princes, and there's going to be contempt by the women and anger by the husbands. So it's a parallel. The lack of following the husband's command will cause the men to become angry, just like King Ahasuerus. Mamukum relays the wise men's counsel, so he's the spokesman for all of them in verse 19. And Mamukum begins with a respectful tone with the king, beginning with his words, "If it pleases the king." It's important we talk about that just a little bit, but we'll talk about that later. There's all these references when somebody has a conversation with the king, you begin, "If it pleases the king." And I've joked in the past that maybe that's a way that we should start to have conversations with our husbands. If it pleases you, we might get a little better response, right? This would always be a way of addressing issues to the king, as he may have a strong reason to want to avoid advice from the advisors for any number of reasons. So they're coming with what they know is going to be a hard pill for him to swallow. So they've done all the research, they've got their recommendation. Then the solution is presented to let a royal edict be issued by him and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, so that it cannot be repealed. That Vashti may no longer come into the presence of King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is more worthy than she. The suggestion is for a royal edict to be issued. An edict is a proclamation having the force of law. So this edict is to be seen as the new law of the land, very specific to a person. It's not a general law. Like, we have laws, you shouldn't go over 55 in a certain zone if it's marked that way, right? It's a general, doesn't matter who's driving through. This is a law that's very specific to one person in regards to another person. This edict will be held to a higher standard by being written in the laws of Persia and Media. So laws of the Persian and Median government could not be, what word am I looking for? Could not be repealed. You didn't get to change it later. It's in full effect and you don't get to change it. And we'll talk about that more when we get later in the book of Esther. So one of the reasons to get the king Ahasuerus to issue an edict was so that it couldn't be repealed. There is another reference to the irrevocable nature of these laws in the book of Daniel. So in Daniel chapter 6, verses 6 through 9, Daniel 6, 6 through 9. Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows: King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any other god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the documents. That is the injunction. So, wow. It wasn't just in the book of Esther that we see it in regards to the Persian courts. We have confirmation in the book of Daniel that, yes, this was true about the laws of the Medes and the Persians. This is true in the New Testament times as well. So in Matthew chapter 14:6, Matthew 14:6 through 9. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod, so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Having been prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me on a platter the head of John the Baptist." Although he was grieved, the king commanded it to be given because of his oaths, because of his dinner guests. He'd spoken words that could not be reversed. A king is only as good as his word. And that's why they wanted it in writing, so it couldn't be reversed. In Esther 1:19, the recommended edict was for that Vashti may no longer come into the presence of King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is more worthy than she. First, Queen Vashti is not to come before King Ahasuerus ever again. That's the first thing they want to get going. Second, she will lose her position in the royal court with all the personal and professional implications. There is some irony in the fact that Queen Vashti's choice to not come before the king when the king commanded is now being honored for the rest of her life. Princes from Persia and Media want the edict, so they have proof in writing that this was the desire of the king. This way, the king could not change his mind and go back to this queen. Queen Vashti would not be coming back. It would be bad for these men if Queen Vashti came back into the royal court after their advice was taken to have her removed from the presence of King Ahasuerus. They're watching out for their own skins. She would have the power to take vengeance on the 7 men of wise counsel or any others that she felt had wronged her in this court. So that's part of the intrigue. I'm sure that there had been situations in the past that they had referred to going, when so-and-so was removed, when she came back, this is what she ended up doing to the people that she felt wronged her. Is that hard to believe? Yeah, that's human nature. So they know that. They're looking forward, and their counsel is, we'll prevent that. Put it in writing, and the king can never change it. Doesn't matter how lovesick he becomes, she can't come back. This is also why there is a second part of the edict which says, and let the king give her royal position to another more worthy than she. These men did not want Queen Vashti to ever have the opportunity to reclaim the position she currently held again. They would fear her retribution. The king, finding another queen, would take away the temptation to bring back Vashti as queen. This would also seem to indicate these wise men knew the power that Queen Vashti held over King Ahasuerus. They saw into the future, and they knew if they didn't get it in writing and make it permanent at some point, whatever his affections were for her, they would rule, and he would become lonely or whatever, and he would desire her again. And he would forget this moment, and he would bring her back. That was one of the reasons they wanted to make sure it was permanent. So that possibility couldn't happen. That's how they're covering themselves. And it may have been when she said no, she didn't think that it was going to be taken to this level. She may have thought that she had such a relationship with him that she could say no and things are going to be fine when the banquet's over and he's not so merry with wine anymore. Right? So she may not have realized the extent. Now, she may have, I don't know. But these men were making sure that it was going to be permanent. In verse 20, the wise men highlight the benefit to the kingdom that the edict will have. When the king's edict, which he will make, is heard throughout all the kingdom, great as it is, then all the women will give honor to their husbands, great and small. It is probably unrealistic to assume not all men were given the honor they desired by their wives. Right. I mean, if we're talking about human nature, we're saying in general, it's probably across cultures. It just doesn't exist in our culture for whatever culture that we know in recent history. It's probably been a thing that's gone on between men and women for a long time. Don't underestimate how important this is to men then and now. This is a biblical principle taught throughout Scripture. In the New Testament, we find it in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 31 through 33. So Ephesians 5, 31 through 33. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is great, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church. Nevertheless, so in spite of the fact that it's a reference to that, let's get back to the moment. Nevertheless, each individual among you also is to love his own wife, even as himself, and the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. It's just to underscore here in the ancient times, as well as in God dealing with what's written in Ephesians for the current time when it was written and for our future time, which is now, men desire respect or honor, as the word is used back here in Esther. This is how God designed them and how God directs wives to respond. It is not to be a punishment. It is to be how you have a healthy relationship. That's what's indicated here. This is not a teaching on Ephesians, so we're not going to go into any more detail than that. It is just to state the obvious fact. It would seem there's some exaggeration being made back in Esther of how all the women of the kingdom would react if Queen Vashti's refusal to obey the command of the king is not dealt with, as well as how all the women will now give honor to their husbands based on the punishment of the queen. There is still truth in the general understanding of what impact taking no action would create and what impact the edict would have. But whenever you say all the women will always or all, that's an exaggeration. Verse 21 highlights the response of those who heard the recommendation of the edict. The word pleased the king and the princes. Fancy that. What a shock. They liked it. That's not a surprise. After King Ahasuerus approves of the edict, Memucan carries out the proposed plan in verse 22. So he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province according to its script, and to every people according to their language, that every man should be the master of his own house, and the one who speaks in the language of his people. Interesting that the indication would be that wasn't going on, isn't it? Like, we're going to shore it up and make sure this is how it happens. So first of all, we have the written documents were sent to all the king's provinces. How many provinces? 127. Very good. The letters were written in a particular script. That would be that the alphabet that was used, particular script is being used. And then the letters were translated into the common language of each province. So again, we have the main language. Remember, King Darius had Aramaic be the general language that was spoken. But these gentlemen want to make sure that everybody who may not be speaking the common language can understand this edict, so they have it written in the cultural language that was accepted in every one of the provinces. The content of the edict is that every man should be the master of his own house and the one who speaks the language of his own people. The impact of speaking in the language of his own people is given importance in Nehemiah. We can see why that's important if we look at the book of Nehemiah, chapter 13, verses 23 and 24. Nehemiah 13, beginning verse 23. In those days, I also saw that the Jews had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. As for their children, half spoke in the language of Ashdod, and none of them was able to speak the language of Judah, but the language of his own people. So the non-Jewish women, married to the Jewish men, were teaching their children the language that they knew, and most probably the culture that they grew up with, including their religious practices. This gave the women more control and power in their home. This was not acceptable to Nehemiah. Again, is this a stretch of the imagination to see how this goes on? Mom stays home all day. Mom's nursing. Mom's cleaning up. Mom's putting down for naps. Mom's there. Her language, her beliefs are going to be what she talks about. And very young, these children would be exposed to that. The dads aren't there to bring that necessary, in this case, contradictory view, because these are Jewish men with Jewish beliefs. Nehemiah's like, this is not good for us. That's what's being talked about back here in Esther as well. The wise men of the Persian courts had come to the same conclusion, that every man should be the master in his own home. The wives throughout the kingdom were to acknowledge that the men were the master of their homes. And one of the best ways to ensure this influence was for the language spoken in the home to be that of the husband. This is the clear wording of the letter sent to all the provinces of King Ahasuerus' kingdom. So it's not a little matter. I don't know about you all. I have a difficult time when it comes to a foreign language. Some people can pick up foreign language like that. I'm so impressed with people that know like 3, 4, whatever languages. Sometimes I struggle with my English language, let alone multiple languages. So here's an edict. Think about the massive land that we've talked about. This kingdom would have encompassed 127 provinces. And now you're saying every woman in the entire kingdom has to learn the language of her husband. Right? We can skip over this verse if we don't realize the impact of what that means. And maybe at home when nobody knows, they could get by with it. But if they're out in public, people are listening. And if she's speaking in her language and not her husband's language, I think they're going to report it. So it's this has massive implications for what happens in this kingdom at this time. So the description of the letter sent to the provinces appears to be different than the edicts that were proposed to the king earlier. So most likely the royal edict concerning Queen Vashti were recorded in the laws of the Medes and the Persians to ensure that they were not repealed. But the letters sent to the provinces carried the tone of what the expectations were to be in the homes of the kingdom. That was not law. You see the difference? What was written about Queen Vashti was an edict and was law. What got written in the letters that went out to all the provinces is not told to us to be of the same level of law that it couldn't be repealed. So they're different in that regard. The direction of the book of Esther takes a predictable path. The king has been disrespected, and the wise men counsel how to resolve the immediate issue with Queen Vashti. That's the first thing that needs to be taking place. The wise men, however, do not stop, as they take the opportunity to use this event to advantage other agendas, potentially. Imagine that. somebody taking an opportunity in a cultural moment to make other changes be related. God uses the hearts of men to move history down a path for his intended purposes. It is still interesting to see how those circumstances unfold in real life. God does the same today because he is the same God and has the same sovereign power. And what comfort we can have as we watch our own lives and our own circumstances around us, knowing God is in fact in control and doing as he intended in our lives. In Romans chapter 8, 26 through 31, we have confirmation of the peace this can bring. Romans 8, beginning in verse 26. In the same way, the Spirit also helps our weakness. If we do not know how to pray as we should, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groaning too deep for words. And he who searches the hearts knows what the mind of the Spirit is, because he intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purposes. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brethren. And these whom he predestined, he also called, and these whom he called, he also justified, and these whom he justified, he also glorified. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who is against us? If we do a diligent study in the book of Esther, we will see the reality of what we have here in Romans. God had a plan, and he carried it out in ways we could never have predicted. It would seem like a really bad thing that Queen Vashti said no to her king, and that the wise men came and created an edict she couldn't come back, and that they forced this idea upon the rest of the kingdom to speak them, right? All of these things are like, wow, this makes no sense. God knew it was coming. God opened the avenue for this path. As we get to the rest of the book of Esther, we're going to see what God does with it and why this moment in history was so important that this event actually occurred at this time. Because God is going to do something magnificent with a young woman named Esther. He's always in control. Right now in our lives, by the way, as I described earlier, with chaos that seems to be abundant, you can stop, you can find a calm spirit when you know he has a purpose, he has a reason, and I can rest in that, even when I don't understand it.